So this evening we are considering Rachel, who along with Leah did build the household of Israel. And what an amazing title that is, to be a builder of the house of Israel. And I think this is an amazing exhortation for us in the story of Rachel and Leah, who were both working with the same aim, to build the household of Israel. But they so easily slip into working against each other, being jealous of each other, wrestling one with another, and trying to prevail over each other. And we too, who are adopted into the household of Israel, the household of faith, who are tasked with building up the household of Israel as well, have this challenge to make sure that we do not make the same mistakes that were made and end up with bitter infighting and warring one with another, but strive together with our minds on the goal of building the household of faith. And I think we have here the record of two faithful women who were both working together in the same aim, but it spiraled out of control, as happened in the house of Jacob. And we must focus on our mission of building Israel. Now, I said we have the record of two faithful women, but when we consider Rachel, sometimes with some of the events that happen, we may wonder, is that the case? Was Rachel a faithful woman? Because we read of things like Rachel stealing the idols from her father, which these kind of things don't seem the things that a righteous woman would do. The way she reacts to being barren is quite different from, for example, Hannah, because Rachel goes to Jacob and says, "Give me children, else I die." But if Rachel was not a faithful woman, why would Jacob choose such a woman to be his wife? Well, why does Jacob choose Rachel? And what is he even doing in Haran? Well, let's just go back a few chapters for context. Come back with me to chapter 27. We've had Jacob purchasing the birthright from Esau, which we know from Hebrews included the blessing, because when Esau weeps for losing out on the blessing, we're told in Hebrews that is him regretting and repenting for selling his birthright for a mess of pottage. But then Jacob, after Esau does not tell his father that he has sold it and tries to take it anyway, Jacob then goes ahead and deceives his father, using deception to take the blessing which may have been rightfully his, but he goes and deceives his father to take it. And of course, then Esau wants to kill him. In Genesis 27, and let's just go in at verse 41, because we read, "And Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father at hand, then will I slay my brother Jacob. And these words of Esau, her elder son, were told to Rebekah. And she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, Behold, thy brother Esau, as touching thee, does comfort himself, purposing to kill thee. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Arise, flee thou to Laban my brother, to Haran." So Rebekah is concerned for Jacob's life, but there is something else that concerns Rebekah, because in verse 46, Rebekah says to Isaac, "I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob take a wife of the daughters of Heth, such as these that are of the daughters of the land, what good shall my life be to me?" And then in chapter 28, Isaac called Jacob because of this concern of Rebekah. And we read, "And he blessed him and charged him and said to him, Thou shalt not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel thy mother's father, and take thee a wife from thence of the daughters of Laban thy mother's brother." And so Jacob is told very clearly by his father who he is to take to be his wife. Someone from Padan Aram, but not just anyone from there. They have to be a daughter of Laban, who is the brother of Rebekah. And at the time, we don't know even if Rebekah and Isaac would have known whether Laban had daughters. Communication would not be like it is today, where you would be updated on the things that happen in your family hundreds of miles away, where they send Jacob with this charge that he is to marry a daughter of Laban. But Jacob has this task to find a wife, to raise up a godly seed, a seed that is worthy of the blessings that he has worked so hard to obtain. And you can imagine Jacob on his way up to Padan Aram, considering his mission that he'd been given of his father to find a wife, a faithful wife, like his mother Rebecca had turned out to be. And Jacob has, of course, the vision in Bethel, where God confirms to him the promises. So Jacob knows that despite the way he had obtained the promises, God was still working with him and was going to bless him. And as Jacob went up to Padan Aram, knowing that he was searching for a wife, he would have considered, surely, the record that was in just a few chapters ago, in chapter, I think, 24, when Rebecca is found by the servant of Abraham. When God guides the servant of Abraham by providence to meet Rebecca at the well outside Haran, God chose a wife for Isaac, and this is what Jacob wanted too. And so where is it that Jacob goes? Well, in chapter 29, we read that Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east, and he looked and beheld a well in the field, and lo, there were 3 flocks of sheep lying by it. And so Jacob comes to the well which we later find is the well that is used of the men of Haran. And we don't know whether this was the same well that Rebecca met the servant of Abraham. And Jacob probably wouldn't have known either whether it was the same well. But surely the record of Rebecca being found by the servant of Abraham would have been one he knew very well. And I'm sure he would have been thinking upon it when he arrived at that well. And so what does Jacob do? Well, verse 4, Jacob said unto them, My brethren, whence be ye? And they said, Of Haran are we. And he said unto them, Know ye Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, We know him. And he said unto them, Is he well? And they said, He is well. And behold, Rachel, his daughter, comes with the sheep. You can imagine how this would have made Jacob feel. He would have had this weight of importance, of the important task that he had, of finding a faithful wife to bring up his faithful seed. And he finds that like God provided a wife for Isaac at the well, so it is when he comes to the well. God has arranged by providence that Rachel is there to meet him at the well, bringing the sheep. And notice the emphasis that is put on who Rachel is and how she's connected to Laban, and how Laban is connected to Rebecca, and how Rebecca is connected to Jacob. We know from verse 6 who Rachel is when they introduce her. We know from chapter 24 who Rebecca is and who Laban is. But in verse 10, the emphasis is very strongly on who Rachel is. It says, And it came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel, who we already know who she is, but it says the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban. We already know who Laban is, his mother's brother. Then Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. So time and time again, we see the emphasis on who Rebecca is, who Rachel is, and who Laban is. Verse 11, And Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. And we see this reaction of Jacob. Now, what I think this is, when Jacob just lifts up his voice and weeps, is the pouring out of all the emotions of Jacob that have been leading up to this event. He had just left everyone he knew, his whole family behind him. And as I said, it wasn't like it is today, where you can easily contact your family who are miles away. He had lost contact with them all. He had left everyone he knew behind him and had gone out into the unknown. He knew when he said goodbye to them that some of them he may not ever see again. Those that he would see, it may be years until he saw them again. And he has found his kin. He has found his family. He has found his mother's family. And we can see from the record that Jacob is much closer to his mother than he is his father. Like Rebecca is much closer to Jacob than she is her other son, Esau. And Jacob has found his mother's family. And also God has caused him to meet a daughter of Laban to be his wife. And we know the story. Jacob works for 7 years for Rachel. And then Laban tricks him. Laban gives him Leah. And then he takes Rachel as well in the promise of serving 7 more years. I think Jacob here is reminded of how, as he as the younger son had deceived his father by pretending to be the older son when he was indeed the younger. So it was that a daughter of Laban, at her father's command, pretended to be the younger when she was indeed the older. And this was something that would affect him for the rest of his life. And we even see when he is in Egypt, that when he's trying to bless his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, there is Joseph trying to switch his hands, trying to transfer the blessing from the older to the younger and the other way around. This is something that he would be reminded of day after day. But in Haran, Jacob is starting his family, and this deception would cause chaos and bitterness in his family that would never get away from him. And I think the lesson for us, brothers and sisters, is when we fail before our God, it's very easy to try and run away from our mistakes, run away from the consequences of what we have done. But we cannot do this. As Jacob finds out, they follow him wherever he goes. But it's important to remember that although we may suffer the consequences for our actions, it doesn't mean that our God will not forgive us. It doesn't mean that our God doesn't care about us. It means our God is working with us, as it was with Jacob. And it's no surprise when Jacob finds himself married to two women when he only wanted to be married to one. And in verse 30, we find that when he goes into Rachel, he loved also Rachel more than Leah and served him yet 7 other years. But it wasn't that she was loved less. It wasn't just that Leah was loved less, because in verse 31, we read that when Yahweh saw Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And so Yahweh sees that Leah is not just loved less, but is indeed hated. And so Leah faces this trial of being the unloved wife, the unwanted wife, while Rachel suffers the trial of being childless. And brothers and sisters, whenever trials come into our lives and we face them, it can be very easy to look around our ecclesias and only see a sea of faces of people who suffer different trials to us, who don't struggle with the thing that we are struggling with. And I would suggest that's probably what happened with Rachel and Leah. When Rachel looked across to Leah and saw her surrounded by sons and was jealous of her, and saw her not suffering in the way that Rachel was suffering, Leah quite possibly was looking back at Rachel, seeing her with her husband, being loved by her husband, being jealous of her for the love that Jacob showed unto her. And so we too will have different trials, one from the other. But it's quite possible that although a brother or sister may not be suffering the way we are, they will be suffering in a different way. And it's so important that we do not allow jealousy and hatred to creep in. And Leah, of course, tries to win Jacob's love, doesn't she, by having son after son after son. But of course, this does nothing, because as we read in verse 20, Jacob, when he served 7 years for Rachel, there was but a few days for the love he had for her. But although this doesn't affect Jacob, it affects Rachel when she sees Leah having son after son after son. And my sister at the moment is pregnant, and is very, very obvious. She's due in a few weeks' time. And you can imagine for Rachel, when Leah was almost constantly pregnant, it being very obvious to her. Every time she saw her, it would be clear that she was again having another son when Rachel hadn't even had one. And it's in these circumstances that we read of the first words of Rachel in chapter 30 and verse 1. We read, "And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. And Jacob very understandably replies with anger that he is not in God's stead. It is not in his hand to give her children, but that she should ask these things of God. But then Rachel has an idea which is not new to the family of Jacob, is it? Which is to give Jacob her handmaid, Bilhah. And where do we see that before? Well, of course, it is the same idea as Sarah had just a couple of generations before. If you just turn back with me to Genesis 16. And this is Sarah who wants to give a seed to Abraham, but finds herself barren, like Rachel. And she has the exact same idea. Genesis 16 and verse 1. Genesis 16. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abraham, behold, now Yahweh hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abraham hearkened to the voice of Sarah. And this is what, of course, produces Ishmael. And if you're on margin, you should notice next to obtain children by her, there's a little note that tells us quite rightly that in the Hebrew, it means I will be built by her. And this is not the normal language for bearing children. This is the normal language for building an altar, building a house. And and Sarah here is wanting to be built or to build by Hagar. And we actually find the exact same language used by Rachel in Genesis 30. But again, it's been translated a little differently to, I guess, make it flow better in the English. Genesis 30 and verse 3. And she said, behold, my maid Bilhah, go into her, that she may bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her, and may also have children by her again, is that I may build, or that I may be built by her. And so what is it that Sarah and Rachel both so desperately wanted to build? Well, turn with me to the book of Ruth. And this is where the title from the series comes from, The Two That Built Israel. Ruth chapter 4. And the context, of course, is Boaz taking Ruth and redeeming her, and it's the blessing that they receive. Ruth chapter 4 and verse 11. And all the people that were in the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. Yahweh make the woman that is come into thine house like Rachel and like Leah, which two, notice not four, which two did build the house of Israel, and do thou worthily in Ephratah, and be famous in Bethlehem. And notice that it's saying these two did build the household of Israel. And why is this strange? Well, Jacob, of course, has children by four women, doesn't he? By Rachel, by Leah, by Bilhah, and by Zilpah. But the Spirit here tells us that it's only two women, Rachel and Leah, who did build the house of Israel. So does that mean that the sons of the handmaids were not building blocks of the house of Israel? Does it mean that they weren't part of the household of faith? Well, of course, it does not. But I think what it does mean is that the children of the handmaids, the Dan and also Naphtali of Bilhah, are considered to have been built by Rachel, not by their natural mother. And what does it mean to be built then into the household of Israel? And why is it that Rachel is able to do this while Bilhah does not? Well, let's just go back to Genesis 30, because I think the answer can only lie in how these children are brought up. Genesis 30, and again, verse 3. Because it says, and she said, behold, my maid Bilhah, go into her, that she may bear upon my knees, that I may have children by her, or that I may build by her. And what does it mean to bear on Rachel's knees? Well, it's clearly figuratively. And it's interesting when we look at this expression of on the knees in relation, as a relation between a mother and a child. We see it a few times in Scripture. And if don't go there, but in I think Genesis 50. We read that Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were brought up upon Joseph's knees. And so we have this image of a mother or a father or a grandparent with the child on their knees. And this is an image of teaching, an image of instructing, an image of bringing up of the children. And this is the role that Rachel wanted to have in the upbringing of these children, the children of the handmaidens. And it's interesting, we don't see this language of on the knees of Sarah in relation with Ishmael, the son of Hagar. It seems that Hagar very much brings up Ishmael. And you'll notice that the record of Ishmael ends very differently from the children of Bilhah, because Ishmael is cast out with the bondwoman. and does not become a building block of the household of faith, the household of Abraham. Or the children of Bilhah become part of the stock and family of faith. And come with me to Isaiah chapter 66, where we see the same image, but instead of it being a literal father or a literal mother, it is God with his people Israel. Isaiah chapter 66. It's a well-known chapter. We'll just quickly dip into verse 8 for context. We read, "Who hath heard such a thing, or who hath seen such a thing? Shall the earth be made to bring forth in one day, or shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion travailed, she brought forth her children. Shall I bring to the birth, and not cause to bring forth, saith Yahweh? Shall I cause to bring forth, and shut up the womb, saith thy God?" And then when we come to verse 12, "For thus saith Yahweh, behold, I will extend peace to her like a river, and the glory of the Gentiles like a flowing stream. Then shall ye suck, ye shall be borne upon her," or if you miss out the italics, "borne upon sides, and be dangled upon knees. As one whom his mother comforteth, so will I comfort you, and ye shall be comforted in Jerusalem." And so God shows himself as a comforting mother to Israel. And the imagery that God uses is the image of God with Israel on his knees, bringing up Israel. And so Rachel's desire to bring up Israel, to build Israel, was to bring up these children, to teach these children in the ways of God. And I'm not saying Bilhah didn't have any involvement. Of course she did. But Rachel was very involved with them. And from Ruth, we can see that it is Rachel that is credited with building these children into the household of Israel. Back in Genesis 6, we find as well that Rachel considers these children to be the gift of God to her. Genesis 30 and verse 6. Because and Rachel said, "God hath judged me, and hath heard my voice." So it was an answer to her prayer. "And hath given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan." Although Rachel's motives are clearly good in what she was doing, was it the right way for her to go about it? I think, of course, the answer has to be no. It wasn't right for Rachel to rush the timeline of God. Like Abraham and Sarah, they should have waited until it was God's time for Rachel to bear children that she could build and bring up into the household of faith. But God, despite Rachel maybe doing this the wrong way, recognizes Rachel's motives and works with these children and builds them as well into the household of God. Build it. But a few verses later, we see Rachel again not waiting on God's time, because she buys the mandrakes from her sister, which again do not lead to her bearing a child, but instead lead to her sister bearing Issachar, and later Zebulun, and finally Dinah. But when we come to verse 22 of Genesis 30, we see that God remembers Rachel, and God hearkens to her prayer and opens her womb, and she conceives and gives birth to Joseph. And she again recognizes that Joseph is a gift of God from her, because we read in verse 23, "And she conceived and bare a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, and said, Yahweh shall add to me another son." And so finally, Rachel has this child, the answer to prayers for many years coming up to this. And how precious would this child have been to her? And it's very clear that this child is very precious to Jacob, because in verse 25, we see that Jacob waits until after Joseph is born, not wanting to risk traveling down to Canaan while Rachel is pregnant, in case it would mean that she would lose the child. But then Jacob talks to Laban, and Laban convinces him, as we know, to stay a while longer in the land. But then when God tries to bless Jacob and cause the flocks to bring forth lambs that he would receive, Laban keeps changing his wages to try and take the blessings that God is showering upon them. But in verse 2 of chapter 31, Jacob sees that things have changed and the time has come to leave, because Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban in verse 2, and behold, it was not towards him as it was before. And so Jacob calls Rachel and Leah together and have this seemingly rare conversation of as a family. And he explains the situation that they are all in. And their response a lot about the relationship that Rachel and Leah with their father. Because in verse 14, Rachel and Leah answered together and said to him, "Is there yet any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not considered of him strangers? For he hath sold us, and hath quite devoured also our money. For all the riches which God hath taken from our father, that is ours, and our children. Now then, whatsoever God hath said unto thee, do." And so Rachel and Leah very clearly feel the same way about their father. They feel that he has treated them badly. And they clearly don't have a lot of love for their father, because they feel that he has treated them as strangers. He has devoured their money, and they don't believe they will give him the inheritance that is rightly theirs. And I think this bothers Rachel more than it bothers Leah. And how do we know that? We'll just turn back to chapter 30 and look at verse 20. And this is when Leah has her final son. Because Leah said, "God hath endowed me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me." And so Leah sees that although her father hasn't given her a dowry, she has seen that God has. God has given her these 6 sons. But Rachel, who at this time only has 1 son, I don't think feels the same way. And I think this is why a few verses later, when they flee from Laban because of this difficult situation that they're in, Rachel takes from Laban, from her father, the most valuable but easily portable possession that he was likely to have, which was his idols. And I know we're not told that it was for the monetary reasons that Rachel took of these idols, but of course we're not told that she took them because she wanted to worship them. And I think it makes a lot of sense for her to have taken them for their monetary value, because again, it would be teaching Jacob the same lesson, because he had known that he rightfully should have received the blessing, but he then took it by deception. Right? He deserved an inheritance, but her father was not planning to give it to her, and she takes it by theft and repeats the sin of Jacob. But we're not told directly the motive that she had. But what we do know is that Rachel will be in the kingdom. And we don't really read about her until she dies in chapter 35, after this incident of her taking the idols. So if she were to be an idolater from her taking the idols, we would have no record of any repentance. And just turn with me to chapter 37, which is how we can be sure that Rachel will be in the kingdom. And this, of course, is the dreams of Joseph. Genesis 30, and we're going at verse 5. "And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. And he said to them, Hear, I pray thee, this dream which I've dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaves stood upright, and behold, your sheaves stood round about, and made obeisance to my sheaf. And his brethren said to him, Shalt thou indeed reign over us, or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. And he dreamed yet another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. And he told it to his father and to his brethren. And his father rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee to the earth? And his brethren envied him, but his father observed the saying. And so this dream of Joseph, that one day his 11 brothers would fall down and worship him, which is in the first dream, that was of course fulfilled in Genesis 42. But the second dream, where the sun, moon, and stars make obeisance to him, and his father interprets as including Joseph's mother Rachel, that could not have been fulfilled in his lifetime because Rachel was already dead. This can only be pointing toward the resurrection when they will all be raised up together in the kingdom. And Rachel will clearly be there. So I think Rachel must have died a faithful woman because otherwise these things would not be fulfilled. Now, the last time we read of Rachel in the Old Testament is in Jeremiah 31. So please just turn there with me. And it's the record of Rachel weeping for her children. And this is well known because it's quoted in Matthew chapter 2. But what's the context here? Well, the context is Jeremiah seeing Judah being taken away into captivity. And let's go in at verse 15. Thus saith Yahweh, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel, weeping for her children, refused to be comforted for her children, because they were not. And verse 16, thus saith Yahweh, refrain thy voice, clearly talking to Rachel, from weeping, and thine eyes from tears, for thy work shall be rewarded, saith Yahweh, and they shall come again from the land of the enemy. And so the work of Rachel in building the house of Israel, as they went up into captivity, looked like it was all lost. But God says, thy work shall be rewarded, because they would return again to their border. But why is it in Ramah that this voice is heard? Well, turn with me to chapter 40 of Jeremiah. Because we find that Ramah was a very important place in relation to the exile. Jeremiah 40 and verse 1. The word that came to Jeremiah from Yahweh, after Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, had let him go from Ramah, when he had taken him bound in chains among all that were carried away captive of Jerusalem and Judah, which were carried away captive unto Babylon. So it seems that Ramah is a key place, a staging ground, a place where they are brought together from all the cities where they're being taken captivity from, brought together to be forced to go into exile from Ramah. And it is there that they're sorted, and Jeremiah is released. Jeremiah sees Israel going into captivity from Ramah. And you can imagine what an awful scene that would have been. And it wasn't just those who were alive at the time seeing this scene of misery. But as Abel wept from, as the cry of Abel wept from the ground, his righteous blood, so Rachel weeps from the grave, weeping for her children as they go into captivity. But how does this make sense when we come to Matthew chapter 2? Because the context here seems to be very different. And I think if it wasn't mentioned as a direct fulfillment in Matthew of Rachel weeping for her children, I don't think anyone would suggest that it was. And I think if someone was to suggest that it was, then people would probably think it was being taken out of context. But it is very clear. So Matthew chapter 2, and let's go in at verse 16. Read, then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and in all the coast thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, in Ramah was there a voice heard, lamentation and weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted because they are not. So how can this be a fulfillment of Jeremiah 31, which is clearly being fulfilled at the time by them going into captivity? Well, I'd be interested in any ideas on this, but I'll give you a suggestion. I think it's clear that this prophecy of Jeremiah isn't explicitly talking about the children being killed in Bethlehem. And I think it's much broader than even the events of Jeremiah. But it is Rachel caring about her children, weeping for her children. Whenever they are under trial, whenever they are being persecuted, Rachel weeps for her children because they were not. When they go into captivity at the time of the Babylonians, when they are being massacred by the hand of Herod, I would suggest when they went into captivity again in AD 70, and maybe even up until today, whenever the children of Rachel, the children of Israel, are mistreated, Rachel weeps for them. And I think this is a beautiful ending to this story of Rachel, who after striving with her sister, striving amongst the household of Israel for almost all her life, is here weeping for all Israel, not just the tribe of Benjamin, not just for Joseph, but she also cries and weeps as the tribe of Judah, along with Benjamin, go into captivity. And later on in Matthew, when the children of Bethlehem, not a city in one of the tribes of her children, but a city in the tribe of Judah, a city with the inhabitants of it were of the tribes that came from Leah, even Judah. She is weeping for them because she is not just weeping for her own children. She's weeping for the children of Israel. She is weeping for the household that fundamentally the main thing to her was the building of Israel. And I think this is the lesson for us, is that we must keep our focus on the task that we have of building up Israel, building up the entire household of faith, weeping for it and working with it, strengthening it, looking forward to the kingdom, when the whole household of Israel, from the time of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, through to David, even up until today, are united for the first time in the kingdom, when all Israel shall be saved.